Hundreds of migrants remain in custody following the Trump administration's Operation Midway Blitz in the Chicago area.
So at that point, one of the deputies stayed with the driver while I went to go do a hands-on search of the vehicle.
The most dangerous criminal is not the one who crosses the border in the dark. It is the one who signs papers in daylight and calls it justice. At 4:47 a.m., while most of Phoenix still slept, the quiet order of that belief began to collapse. 3 unmarked vehicles rolled into a gated neighborhood where power usually slept behind hedges and alarm systems. The target was not a warehouse or a known cartel hideout. It was the private home of a sitting judge, a man whose name appeared daily on court calendars and legal citations. As dawn reached each city, the arrests revealed a pattern impossible to dismiss. These individuals were not desperate, they were comfortable. Their lifestyles reflected long-term planning, asset accumulation, and family security. This was corruption without urgency, crime without chaos. It thrived because it did not look like crime at all. Investigators began asking a more troubling question: if enforcement agencies could be repurposed so effectively, what did that mean for communities relying on them? Every delayed warrant represented a shipment delivered, every dismissed case translated into overdoses that would later be labeled accidental. The system did not just fail to protect, it actively facilitated harm. By mid-morning, dozens were in custody, but the real damage had already been done over years. Trust erodes slowly and collapses suddenly. That collapse was now public. Citizens watching the news faced an uncomfortable reality. The people tasked with stopping the poison had become its most reliable escorts. And once that realization sets in, restoring faith becomes far harder than executing warrants. The most disturbing aspect of the network was not its reach, but its respectability. Each exposed official carried credentials meant to reassure the public: law degrees framed on walls, service records highlighted in commendations, career narratives built around order and protection. These identities were not covers, they were tools. They created immunity through expectation. Prosecutors manipulated procedure with expertise gained over decades. By understanding the exact pressure points of the legal system, they delayed actions just long enough to protect shipments without attracting suspicion. Border officials applied selective enforcement, allowing certain vehicles through while maintaining overall seizure statistics that preserved their reputations. Deputies controlled evidence flow, quietly redirecting confiscated substances back into circulation. None of this required violence. The absence of brutality made the operation harder to detect and easier to rationalize. There were no shootouts, no desperate chases, no visible breakdowns of order. Instead, harm traveled calmly through forms, signatures, and digital approvals. The system remained clean while communities absorbed the consequences. Psychologically, this type of betrayal cuts deeper. It does not arrive with warning. It erodes confidence, slowly teaching citizens that compliance offers no protection when those in charge have already sold it. Parents trusted labels, judges trusted records, patients trusted pills that looked identical to prescriptions. The victims rarely understood they were part of a criminal equation until it was too late. Investigators recognized that these officials did not see themselves as criminals in the traditional sense. They viewed their actions as transactions within a larger machine they believed was unstoppable. Rationalization replaced responsibility. Distance replaced guilt. That mindset allowed them to operate without the fear typically associated with crime. The exposure of such figures forces society to confront a moral contradiction. Authority relies on trust, but trust becomes dangerous when it is unconditional. How many warning signs were ignored because questioning them felt inappropriate? How often were doubts dismissed as cynicism? As each badge was removed and each office searched, the illusion of isolated misconduct collapsed. This was not about a few bad actors. It was about a professional culture that allowed silence to function as permission. And once silence becomes currency, corruption no longer needs secrecy. It only needs time. Following the money revealed the architecture of the operation more clearly than any confession could. Financial analysts traced payments that moved through shell companies, offshore accounts, and domestic foundations designed to appear charitable. On paper, everything complied with regulatory standards. In reality, these channels converted public authority into private wealth. The sophistication of the financial structure suggested outside guidance. Cartels did not simply bribe officials, they invested in them. Assets were diversified, risk was minimized, family members were insulated, education funds, property portfolios, and retirement instruments ensured loyalty far beyond immediate gain. Corruption became a career path, not a side income. From the outside, the house looked like stability itself. Clean lines, family photographs, professional awards displayed with care. Inside, however, federal investigators found something that did not belong to any version of lawful authority. Beneath polished floors and framed oaths lay a hidden infrastructure designed for volume secrecy and death. Shelving built for industrial use, packaging sealed with precision, narcotics measured not in grams but in lives lost. The scale alone forced a question that could not be ignored. How long had this been happening beneath the very feet of justice? What made the system resilient was its normalization. Once financial benefits arrived consistently, ethical boundaries adjusted quietly. Investigators observed that many participants showed no signs of panic even when arrests began elsewhere. They trusted the structure to hold. That trust proved misplaced but revealing. This financial ecosystem also explained longevity. Officials were not pressured with threats alone, they were rewarded with stability. That stability reduced the likelihood of whistleblowing and increased mutual dependence. Each participant became a liability to the others, reinforcing silence. When these flows were frozen, the scale shocked even seasoned investigators. Millions in cash, properties acquired through layered ownership, vehicles registered under corporate names that masked control. The wealth told a story of years, not months. It confirmed that the system had matured unnoticed. The exposure of this money trail raised an unsettling question for the public: how many similar structures remain intact because no one has mapped them yet? Financial transparency exists on paper, but enforcement depends on will. Without it, numbers become camouflage. By the time indictments were unsealed, the financial evidence made denial irrelevant. The story was no longer about accusations, it was about proof, and proof once seen demands accountability beyond individual sentences. While indictments and press conferences captured headlines, the real damage unfolded far from courtrooms and microphones. It appeared in emergency rooms filled before sunrise, in school hallways missing familiar faces, and in quiet homes where a single pill altered an entire family's future. The network exposed by the investigation had not merely moved narcotics efficiently, it had redefined who the victims were. These drugs did not arrive wrapped in street mythology or obvious danger. They arrived disguised as medicine molded to resemble safety and distributed through channels that inspired trust. Elderly patients followed instructions printed on labels they believed were legitimate. Teenagers accepted pills that looked identical to what a doctor once prescribed after a sports injury. Caregivers saw nothing unusual. The system relied on familiarity to neutralize suspicion. Hospitals across the region documented a rise in overdose cases that defied traditional patterns. Many victims had no history of substance abuse. Medical staff struggled to explain how lives unraveled so suddenly, often without warning signs. Each case added pressure to already strained healthcare systems, while answers lagged behind grief. The emotional cost extended well beyond statistics. Families searched for meaning in loss that felt senseless. Parents questioned how protection failed so completely. Communities accustomed to trusting institutions found themselves navigating uncertainty, unsure which assurances still mattered. The damage was not confined to those who consumed the drugs. It reached anyone who depended on the integrity of systems meant to safeguard them. Law enforcement agencies faced a parallel crisis. Officers who had served honorably encountered suspicion simply because of the uniforms they wore. Judges found their decisions scrutinized through lenses shaped by betrayal. The ripple effect eroded confidence, broadly transforming isolated corruption into collective doubt. Investigators understood that arrests, while necessary, could not restore what had already been lost. Accountability addressed responsibility, but not consequence. The question shifted toward prevention, oversight, and cultural change. How does a society protect itself when danger travels under official authorization? How do institutions regain legitimacy when their symbols have been compromised? This was not an impulsive crime or a moment of weakness. Every detail suggested planning, patience, and confidence. Confidence that no one would look too closely. Confidence that the robe protected more than it revealed. The judge had not smuggled drugs himself, nor needed to. His value was far greater. He controlled time. He controlled delay. He controlled which cases slowed, which warrants stalled, which investigations quietly expired under procedural weight. This phase of the story rarely generates dramatic footage, yet it defines the lasting impact. It is where corruption translates into funerals rather than filings. The harm endured quietly, without spectacle, but with permanence. And in that silence, the cost of betrayal becomes unmistakably human. As legal proceedings moved forward, attention gradually drifted elsewhere, but the implications remained unresolved. Courtrooms processed charges, policymakers proposed reforms, and agencies announced new oversight measures. On paper, progress appeared measurable. In reality, the deeper question lingered beneath procedural language: could trust be rebuilt once it had been systematically sold? The investigation revealed that corruption did not require chaos to thrive. It required predictability, hierarchy, and patience. The individuals involved exploited not loopholes, but norms. They relied on the assumption that authority equaled integrity. That assumption had allowed the network to function for years without meaningful resistance. Future safeguards now face a challenge that goes beyond compliance. Audits and regulations may detect financial irregularities, but they cannot measure intent. Oversight committees can review decisions, yet they remain dependent on the honesty of those being reviewed. Without cultural accountability, structure alone remains vulnerable. This reckoning forces a broader societal reflection. How much reliance should be placed on credentials rather than conduct? How often does respect discourage scrutiny? The exposure of this network suggests that unquestioned trust may be the most valuable asset corruption can acquire. Communities watching these developments are left navigating uncertainty. Many want reassurance that lessons have been learned. Others fear that similar systems persist undetected, operating with equal sophistication. The absence of visible wrongdoing no longer guarantees safety. Investigators acknowledge that this case may represent only one chapter in a much larger narrative. Financial trails continue to expand. Related inquiries remain active. Each new lead raises the possibility that the structure uncovered was not unique, but exemplary. Ultimately, the responsibility for accountability extends beyond institutions. It rests with public awareness, sustained attention, and the refusal to normalize silence. Systems change only when oversight becomes expectation rather than reaction. This story does not end with verdicts. It ends with a choice. Whether to accept that some doors remain closed or to insist that power answer to those it serves. Thank you for engaging with this investigation and for recognizing that accountability begins with informed reflection. The future depends on what society chooses to question next. This investigation exposes a reality far more unsettling than a single crime or a handful of corrupt individuals. At its core, the story reveals how power, when left unquestioned, can quietly transform institutions meant to protect society into instruments of harm. What began with the discovery of massive narcotics hidden beneath the home of a respected judge unfolded into a multi-state network where authority itself became the cartel's most valuable asset. The most dangerous actors were not those operating in the shadows, but those acting in plain sight. Judges manipulated time and procedure. Prosecutors redirected justice through paperwork. Border officials and law enforcement officers controlled access points that determined which shipments moved freely. This was not chaos or desperation. It was an orderly, disciplined system built on trust credentials and the assumption that legitimacy equals integrity. The human cost gives this story its true weight. Drugs disguised as medicine reached people who never believed they were at risk. Senior students, families who trusted labels and institutions. Overdose statistics became empty chairs at dinner tables, unanswered phone calls, and lives permanently altered. Arrests and asset seizures addressed responsibility, but they could not undo the damage already done. Investigators understood immediately that this discovery could not exist in isolation. Large operations do not survive on one signature alone. They require silence from clerks, hesitation from prosecutors, cooperation from enforcement officers, and blind spots inside oversight systems. The question shifted from who had done this to how many others had made it possible. At that moment, the house stopped being evidence of personal corruption and became proof of a system compromised from within. The central message is clear: systems do not fail suddenly. They erode slowly when silence replaces scrutiny and respect discourages accountability. Corruption thrives not only on greed, but on the collective decision to look away because questioning feels uncomfortable or inappropriate. Looking forward, the future depends on whether this case becomes an exception or a warning. Increased audits, oversight, and reforms may help, but cultural vigilance matters more than policy. Trust must be paired with verification. Authority must be earned continuously, not assumed permanently. This story ultimately asks one ethical question that remains unanswered: how much power should ever exist without challenge? thank you for taking the time to follow this investigation. Your attention, reflection, and willingness to question are essential because accountability does not begin in courtrooms. It begins with informed citizens who refuse to accept silence as normal. What unsettled seasoned agents most was not the drugs or the money, but the ease with which power had been converted into protection. The judge had lived openly, attended public events, issued rulings, and spoke about law with practiced authority. Meanwhile, an invisible pipeline moved poison through the region with legal efficiency. If one respected figure could operate this way, how many more were embedded where no one wanted to look? Before dawn fully broke, the investigation had already outgrown the walls of that home. What began as a raid was now a reckoning, and somewhere beyond Phoenix, others connected to the same web were waking up unaware that their protection had just failed. The collapse of one pillar exposed the outline of an entire structure. Within minutes of the Phoenix raid, synchronized operations unfolded across multiple states, each one aimed not at street-level crime, but at positions of authority. These were not arrests designed for spectacle. They were calculated removals of individuals who occupied strategic points in the legal and enforcement chain. Timing mattered, precision mattered, silence mattered. Prosecutors with reputations built on high conviction rates were identified as gatekeepers who redirected attention and delayed accountability. Border supervisors once praised for efficiency were revealed as filters deciding which shipments moved uninterrupted. Local deputies entrusted with evidence integrity had quietly turned seized narcotics back into inventory. Each arrest reinforced a single conclusion: this was not infiltration, it was integration. What emerged was a system that functioned because it appeared legitimate. Paperwork flowed correctly. Vehicles moved under official markings. Licenses were approved without friction. On the surface, everything complied with regulation. Beneath it, cartel logistics adapted to government procedure rather than avoiding it. This adaptation was the true innovation. It eliminated risk, reduced violence, and maximized profit by transforming institutions into infrastructure. The geographic spread confirmed intent. Operations reached across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, and beyond. Such coordination required trust among conspirators, shared financial incentives, and confidence that oversight mechanisms could be neutralized. That confidence did not come from bravado, it came from experience. These officials had tested boundaries and learned where resistance stopped.